Next is our Science and Education segment with Barbara Brabetz, our host. And Barbara will be interviewing Dr. Heidi Newberg. Dr. Newberg is from RPI, and she'll be talking about her role as a science educator at RPI. Let's watch.
Welcome to the Science and Education segment on Impact. I'm Barbara Brabetz. My guest today, fellow woman scientist, Dr. Heidi Newberg. Welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be here again.
Terrific. We're going to talk today more about science and education together. What it's like to be educated as a woman scientist, we'll bring gender into that, and then talk about what it's like to have a career in the sciences. Both of us are academics, that is, we're faculty members at colleges, and that presents a certain set of challenges. So could you tell us, or remind the audience, how you got to love science so much?
Oh, I don't know if I got that way or I started that way.
Yeah,
I don't know. I think, I just really, I heard a segment on the radio when I was younger of someone interviewing a dancer. And they interviewed the dancer and they said, would you recommend to someone that your children or young people that they become a dancer? And they said, well, no, dancing is something you do because you have to do. It's not something you do because that's a good career. But if you have to do it, then yes, you should do it. And I kind of feel that way about being a physicist. That for me, it's just what I do. It's how I think. It's what I do. I ask why.
Do you turn it off at night? I mean, I find myself to be, it's probably more like therapy than a show today. I find myself to be very curious about many things. And I think that curiosity is fundamental to all of investigative science. I appreciate when people are able to explain things to me, or when I can fiddle with something, break it, try to put it back together again, sometimes not so successfully. But can you turn it off? I mean, do your critical thinking skills ever go to sleep?
I don't think so. I mean, I do sometimes get so tired I don't want to move. That does happen.
Sister, I hear you.
But no, I think I get distracted. I mean, a lot of times, I have 4 children, right? And so, when I go home, there's a lot of distractions.
Oh, I bet. There's backpacks with God knows what kind of lunch meat still left in them.
I was that this morning, and you can never find those bathing suits, and I was looking for bathing suits and hats. So crowd
control and curiosity, two vital components to your life.
Right.
So physics. If someone were to put a label on physics, for example, I'm a biochemist. I come out of chemistry department. So chemistry is the study of matter and its changes. But then a physicist says, wait. Physics is much more fundamental than that. So how would you label physics as a discipline?
So I kind of think of the physics training is really all about problem solving. And it's learning to come up with explanations for what's going to happen, predictions of what is going to happen. I mean, things you might learn in high school, you might learn about the projectile motion. Something goes up and it comes down, and if you can calculate what angle you send it up and how fast it goes, and you calculate where it's gonna come down, and you're trying to come up with the mathematics that describes the world we're in. If you don't care whether it applies to the world that we're in, then you're a mathematician, right?
Yes.
Mathematicians do the math, and they don't care if it really applies to the world where we are. But if you like doing the math and you want it to predict what really happens in our world, and you want to do problem solving to figure out how that is, that's really what it is, physics. And I think that I'm maybe slightly different than some physicists, because for me, I really like the physics, but it's really more for me about the problem solving and the creativity part of it, and less about what that's applied to. And I think that's maybe why I kind of drifted into astronomy from the physics background. because there's a lot going on in astronomy, and there's a big open spaces and lots to discover. I mean, when I teach at RPI, in the physics courses that I teach, I mean, all the physics courses that you take as an undergraduate, you never cover anything that's been discovered in the past 100 years. I mean, it's really, most of it's 400 years old physics. And when I teach astronomy, I'm into what happened this year by the third week, and so it's a much faster field, but it's the same concepts that I'm applying to that.
Well, another thought that I had while listening to you too, certain fields of science, we all go by the scientific method. It's kind of a law, a set of guidelines we use to design experiments, and to test those experiments, and then to make conclusions based on the data that we get from those experiments, and then come up with phrases or theories behind which the experimentation is consistent with the theory. Certain sciences, let's take biology for example, we can design an experiment and we can test that experiment in a lab, say running a rat through a maze, and see if we change the maze parameters, how will the rat behave. But in your field, you can't manipulate the universe and then see how it will behave.
Turn up the mass.
Right. Wouldn't that be nice? Turn back time, go forward in time.
Add a little more, hydrogen, add a little bit more carbon.
That's it.
See what happens.
Yeah, so you're really stuck with an experiment that's already happened or is happening as we speak. And so your creative design of that particular hypothesis really has to be on the fly. Talk about problem solving. The problems out there, you have to kind of back calculate what the theories are going to be from it.
I actually don't really, I don't really feel like I follow the scientific method that people are taught in high school.
And why is that?
I think that the processes by which scientists make discoveries are changing in all fields, and in astronomy, for the reasons that you just laid out, they never were quite in the design and experiment and test your hypothesis mode. What's kind of happening in astronomy right now, and this, in some sense, other fields are also experiencing this, is that we have a lot more data than we ever used to have. I mean, we have these digital cameras, and the digital cameras are taking data in all different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, and this data is being made available on the internet.
Right, there's
in fact, most of the data that I'm using is public. Anyone can compete with me.
Yeah, there are amateur astronomers who can apply the same algorithms to the material that you're working on.
That's right. And so I guess the way I've made most of my discoveries is by going, I mean, I've worked on big projects that make enormous databases of data. So I've helped to create those databases of data. And then I go into the data and I look at it and I try to understand what the data is telling me.
The patterns?
That you looking for patterns. So I'll look at the data and I will look at the number of stars as a function of distance in some direction. And I'll say, okay, this is what I expect, what did I get? And if they match, then I say, okay, I know what I'm doing. And if they don't match, then I'm like, well,
scratch your head.
What is this? And then, and so a little bit of the scientific method comes in, because now you have an observation that doesn't match your expectations, right? And so then you can come up with a theory for why you think that's true, and then you need other data to test that with. And so I may be able to look at the database in several different ways and make sure that they all agree with the theory that I come up for why it doesn't match what I thought it was going to be. But it doesn't really match very well onto the scientific method that I learned in high school. That really started out with, I'm not even going to look at the data, I'm not even going to have data until I come up with an experimental design. And You know, I think what we're doing, we're collecting so much data that, you know, I worked for 16 years, I worked on something called the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. And that's an extremely successful astronomy project where they just imaged 10,000 square degrees of the sky. That's like a quarter of everything you can see. You know, they imaged 10,000 square degrees of the sky in 5 different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, and then took 1 million spectra where they take 1 million objects and they look at detailed what does the amount of light versus the part of the electromagnetic spectrum look like. And then there's just a big database. And so the database was roughly designed for a particular experiment, but it wasn't the experiment that I was doing with it. And it wasn't the experiment that most of the people were doing with that data. So it just created this big database of knowledge, and then you could go into it just to see what the database itself tells you, and then say, is this what I expected to find? And then that's kind of where my inquiry starts.
So the richness of what can come out of any data set in this digital age, when we can collect data cheaply, openly, and we can share it with so many people, kind of creates this stampede of information and speculation about what's going on in the universe. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. And I think that we share the data with each other more than we ever used to. In fact, my funding agency requires it. You know, you have to share your data. You keep it for yourself for a year or two, but after that, you have to share it. And it's because other people might use your data for something you never would have, and so you end up getting more out of the data. You know, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey was originally funded to look for what we call the large-scale structure of galaxies. So galaxies, you know, a couple decades ago were thought to be randomly positioned all over the universe. They're not random. They're organized into walls, and there are places where there are voids where there aren't any, and there's clusters and these big structures of galaxies. And the Sloan Digital Sky Survey was designed to measure the biggest size of those structures. But, you know, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey has, you know, found new types of information about asteroids. You know, it found a comet. I've done a lot of work on the structure of the Milky Way galaxy by looking at stars from that survey. It's made huge advances in our understanding of quasars, galaxy evolution, you name it. Any part of astronomy that there is has had results that have come from that data, even though it wasn't originally collected for that purpose.
If you look at the history of science and science discovery, let's go 400 years back to the classical physics that we think of. It was really done as a hobby. I mean, there was no cable. Right?
Nothing to do.
Nothing to do. No, so there was a leisure class who really took on science, again, to fulfill their curiosity. They had the capacity to do science because they were the leisure class.
Or they had the funding from the leisure
Or they had the right, or they were funded by people who had the opportunity to give them the funding to do that. Exactly. These days, science doesn't really work like that. I mean, there are the Richard Bransons of the world who may be doing science for the sake of science, the X Prize, for example. But we earn a living doing science, so it kind of changes things. Can you talk a bit about what it's like being a woman in physics or a woman in the academy? Where are the challenges, for example, in being a faculty member at a research university versus working in a government lab?
So I actually did work in a government lab on my postdoctoral part of my career. So I was in graduate school, and then after graduate school I went to Fermilab as a postdoc, and then after that I came to Rensselaer as a faculty member there. I think I never really noticed I mean, there is a difference in not being part of a majority. So I think that in my career, because I've been a minority in gender, I really have an understanding for what it's like to be a minority, and so.
So what are the facts of physics when it comes to gender?
Okay, so the first thing I think that happened to me in college, and you don't really realize it until later, most of the time, But when I was an undergraduate, there were 20% of the school was female at that time. And so you stand out in class, and you stand out at breakfast, and everybody know my name, and I knew a couple people's names. And so you feel like you're never anonymous. And that can be a good thing, because if you want to become noticed, it's great. You can get a lot of notoriety, more easily. But if you don't understand something, it can make you feel like you're afraid to ask the question, because you're afraid that someone will think you're dumb, and you're afraid that if you say something stupid, then women are stupid. And
so it's not just individual anymore. You're representing 51% of the population. It's quite a mantle.
I think that it keeps you back if you have questions that don't get answered, and if you don't feel like you're part of the group, and that you can interact and study with other students.
Well, the same is true in your working career, I'm sure. Do you have any advice for either minority by gender or minority by race, for people out there who really are looking to the sciences because they have that curiosity we talked about earlier?
Well, I think that this is something that I think people have misunderstood before, and we'll try to say it more clearly, that it isn't fair that you have to compensate, but I think that there are a number of things that you can do yourself, so in some sense, if I don't feel like I can ask a question because I'm afraid to ask the question, that's something, in some sense, that's coming from inside me. No one told me that. No one made that rule. In fact, it probably isn't even true.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so I think that you have to be a little stronger in yourself and get over a few hurdles that maybe other people don't have those hurdles, but a significant number of them are in yourself, and I've had women or minority students that come in my office, and I'll tell them, you know what, if you ask a dumb question, I won't be offended. It's okay. You could get those questions answered, and it won't be a problem, so you don't have to think that way. And I remember the next step, when I kind of went towards graduate school, people started saying, well, you go to graduate school, it's hard to have kids and be a scientist, and then they're worried that you're going to have kids, or you're worried that they think that you're going to have kids, or you're worried that they care, and it comes up. But I think for scientists that are my age, these kinds of barriers, it wasn't true for an older generation of women. I mean, they actually weren't allowed to touch telescopes, or they actually weren't allowed to be in the lab, or there actually were physical barriers to keep them from success. And I think for my generation, the barriers were a little softer.
Mm-hmm.
That they were sort of challenges that challenged you the whole way but never stopped you. Why should I, because I'm a woman, be told that that there are issues about having kids? I mean, there were issues for the men.
Of course.
There were issues for the men.
Just more subtle, really. People never discussed it.
No one ever told them, and no one ever, discussed it as a potential issue for them and come up, and they didn't have to go and talk about it in their group sessions, and they didn't have to, answer the questions about it. But if you can kind of ignore that, then it isn't really stopping you, right? And I kind of went through my career, and I had kids when I wanted to have kids or when I could have kids, and I didn't really worry about the implications it would have for my career at all. I mean, I just said, okay, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Now, you wrote a couple articles on this particular very, very personal path that you've taken. How can the viewers read your article?
Oh, well, there is a section on my website at RPI. So if you go to www.rpi.edu/ and then a tilde, NEWBEH, because it's the first 5 letters of my last name plus the first letter of my first name.
We'll put it on the
We'll
screen.
put it on the screen. Okay. If you go there, you can find pictures in there. Probably you don't want to see those, but there are down there. There are articles that I've written on being a woman in science.
Wonderful. Well, you've made a tremendous impact on me today, and certainly an impact on science as a curriculum. Female or no female, it don't make no difference to me. But I applaud you for what you've been able to do in your career, and I look forward to hearing what you'll be doing in the future.
Okay.
Dr. Heidi Newberg, it's been wonderful to have you here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks so much. You've been watching the Science and Education segment on Impact. I'm Barbara Brabetz with my guest Heidi Newberg. Thank you.
We've come to the end of another episode of Impact. I'm Nick Barber, your host. And remember, we want to hear from you, so email us at impact@proctors.org or go to Facebook, enter Impact Show, and like us on Facebook. So we'll see you next week, and thanks for watching.
Proctors, bringing the best in arts, education, and entertainment.